The informal meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging is called to order. It is my distinct pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our panel on follow-up to Resolution 75/152, titled Follow-up of the Focus Area of the 10th Working Session, Discussion on Normative Inputs. I now give the floor to Ms. Amal Abu Rafe, Chief of the Program on Aging in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Mr. Rio Hada, Officer in Charge of Human Rights and Economic and Social Issues Section of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights, for their joint presentation in connection with the conference, Room Paper A/AC.278/2020/CRP.2. Ms. Abu Rafe, Mr. Hada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I'm very happy to join my colleague Rio to introduce the conference room paper for this panel, which will allow for a more in-depth discussion with experts on the adequacy of the normative framework of the international human rights system and its implementation mechanisms for protecting the human rights of older persons as they relate to the two focus areas that we had discussed at the 10th session. The conference room paper is posted online and it analyzes 94 inputs from member states, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and the UN system. I hope delegations have familiarized themselves with the content of the paper. If you have not, no worries. My colleague Rio will walk us through the key takeaways from that paper. Rio, I pass on the presentation to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal, and thank you, Madam Chair. I will start the brief presentation of this paper with the focus area on education, training, and lifelong learning and capacity building. In terms of general overview, the working document points out that constitutional guarantees varied in definition and scope with regard to older persons' right to education, training, lifelong learning, and capacity building. Many countries had general guarantees without reference to age. Some had specific guarantees for older persons, both explicit and implicit, and others had combinations of both. There's no general or specific guarantees comprehensively covered all the areas of education, training, lifelong learning, and capacity building for older persons. With regard to existing standards, responses refer to the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights and UNESCO conventions, as well as UNESCO's recommendations on adult learning and education as particularly relevant. In terms of scope of the rights, responses noted that education is a multiplier right. It can unlock and increase enjoyment of all other human rights. They noted the interrelated nature of key normative elements. Education is also a means to eliminate discriminations, including ageism. Submissions identify key normative elements using the 4A's framework. Availability, a sufficient quantity of functional programs, facilities should be available for older persons. Accessibility in terms of programs, facilities, and services accessible to older persons, including elements of coverage, eligibility, affordability. It's important to note that accessibility includes both physical and economic accessibility, as well as in terms of information accessibility. Acceptability, the programs, facilities, and services should be of quality and culturally appropriate and sensitive to gender and life course requirements. And adaptability means that education should be flexible and meets the need of older persons within diverse social and cultural setting. And other elements indicated that standards should recognize older persons' contributions, their creative, artistic, and intellectual abilities, and as the transmitters of information, knowledge, traditions, and cultural values. Turning to state obligations, inputs noted member states' obligation to take immediate steps to the maximum available resources towards progressive realization of the rights and to also ensure non-retrogression. Contributions in this area are collated in the working document under the typology of obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill. Among the special consideration noted in the submissions are need for equal opportunity to learn modern information technology to reduce digital divide, need to change in needs of labor markets with vocational training adapted to older persons, and addressing ageism in the provision of education. I now turn to the other focus area on social protection and social security, including social protection floors. As general overview, similar to the other focus area, submissions indicated that there is a high degree of inconsistency and limited coverage and general paucity of specific guarantees for older persons. Responses suggested a wide range of measures that should fall within the definition, including social insurance, contributory and non-contributory pensions, combinations of different approaches. In terms of existing standards, responses referred in particular to ILO's normative social security framework of conventions and recommendations as a starting point. On key normative elements, the working document highlights ensuring availability by setting criteria for pensionable age, qualifying period, the scope of coverage, and so on. Ensuring adequacy, that means guarantees for social protection and social security that should prevent or at least alleviate poverty and social exclusion and allow life in dignity for older persons. The key normative element of access should include coverage and eligibility. The responses emphasize the importance of non-contributory schemes as all older persons should be covered by social security systems. The responses also highlighted the principles of equality and non-discrimination, including gender equality and participation of older persons in the design of programs. In terms of state obligation, the document highlights measures to protect in terms of ensuring third parties do not infringe upon the enjoyment of the right. The measures to fulfill the right by taking positive steps towards its realization, including ensuring non-retrogression of the right, for example, by ring-fencing social protection expenditures in times of crisis and austerity. In terms of specific considerations, responses noted that programs should be evidence-based, rights-based, and reflect social values. Programs should be flexible and consider personal and different circumstances of older persons, including income, geographic location, gender, and specific needs of groups in vulnerable situations. So, Madam Chair, on behalf of both DESA and OSHR, we hope that this brief introduction to the working document will facilitate active discussion at this session. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Abu Rafi and Mr. Hada for their joint presentation. Following the joint presentation by our UN colleagues, we will now proceed with a panel discussion. The panel is moderated by Mr. Andrew Byrnes, Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. The panelists who are also joining us this afternoon are Mr. Matthias von Schwanenflügel, Professor and Director General for Demographic Change, Older Persons and Social Security at the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth of Germany. Mr. Francisco Cevallos Tejada, Technical Secretary of the National Council for Intergenerational Equality, Ecuador. Ms. Barbara Mikolajczyk, Professor at the Faculty of Law and Administration of the University of Silesia in Katowice, Poland, and Mr. Marvin Formosa, Director of the International Institute on Aging, United Nations, Malta. I would now like to invite the moderator and panelists to commence the panel discussion. Mr. Barnes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. It's my privilege to be on this panel as the moderator. And first of all, I'd like to inform the working group about a number of organizational arrangements for the meeting. This informal meeting is being held using remote simultaneous interpretation, and I'd kindly ask participants to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by the interpreters when they're working remotely, and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. Participants may select the preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose from the none option to hear the original language. Participants will not be able to unmute their microphones or engage their video unless they are given the floor. When called upon to speak, the participant will receive a message saying that their streaming is approved. Please then press the video button appearing in that message in order to share your video and audio. If you face any audio or video difficulties during the meeting, please use the Restart All Lines button above the hand icon. Should the problem persist, please reload your browser. It's now my pleasure to invite our distinguished panelists to give their presentation. I'd like to invite Mr. Matthias von Schwanenflügel to take the floor. You have the floor, Matthias. Seem to.
Mr. Moderator, we're troubleshooting. There seems to be a technical issue. Bear with us just 1 second.
Okay, thank you. We'll give them a moment, I think, to sort this out, but if it's going to take longer than a moment, we might then come to you, Mr. Cevallos Tejada, but let us just wait, as we want to take full advantage of all the available time we have.
So what do you want me to do, Andrew?
Okay, you're on, Matthias, please. Yep, we couldn't see you before, so now you have the floor.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I'll continue. And regarding the first issue of lifelong learning and capacity building, as the background paper prepared by Dessa points out, and I really want to thank Dessa, and I really want to thank OHCHR for this great paper. It is really very, very well done. Thank you. So the paper points out, one can state, that while on the normative side, many good examples have been presented on the national level, there still remains work to be done, a lot. So the legally binding international instruments in this area, while not excluding older persons, do not explicitly list older persons as addressees of the rights enshrined. And therefore, the treaty bodies rarely do investigate how these obligations are implemented with regard to older persons, or whether there are special needs of older persons in this field. For instance, CESCR only once issued a general comment on the right to lifelong learning. WHO in the 10th session pointed out that, quote, lifelong learning is a life course approach strategy that enables older persons to have the knowledge and skills to manage their health, to keep abreast of ICT developments, to participate, to adjust to aging, to maintain their identity, and to keep interested in life. ILO puts the spotlight on the importance of lifelong skills development as essential for continued participation in the labor market. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that skills for using ICT devices can be essential in times of health crisis to participate in social and economic life. Figures for the EU provided by the Fundamental Rights Agency have shown that the digital gap between the generations is considerable. Therefore, in 2020, the Council of the EU agreed on Council conclusions on human rights, participation and well-being of older persons in the era of digitalization, putting a focus on the importance of lifelong learning and skills development. The DESA background paper reminds us of the UNESCO recommendation on adult learning of ILO publications and WHO standards, listing 7 elements reaching from basic literacy skills, including ICT literacy, to the principle of learning as an ongoing lifelong process of empowering human beings throughout their lives to actively engage with social issues, health issues, well-being, etc. Thus, I dare to conclude lifelong learning is one of the essentials for a good and active aging of the individual and societies. The suggested obligations by DESA provide guidance on the various measures that should be taken to fulfill obligation to provide access to education, training, lifelong learning, and capacity building. Tomorrow, OHCHR will conduct a side event to present a study called Update to the 2012 Analytical Outcome Study on the normative standards in the international human rights law in relation to older persons, which has been submitted as a working paper for this year's session. The study observes that there has been only modest follow-up in the work of the treaty bodies regarding the issue of lifelong learning for older persons. The study states that, quote, a number of submissions addressed the consequences of the lack of a specific, detailed guarantee of the rights of older persons to education, training, and lifelong learning. And the study points out that, quote, lack of specific, comprehensive, and integrated normative framework appears to be a headwind in the way of more effectively advancing realization of the human rights of older persons. Thus, we should move on now. After having identified the gaps in this area, we should now discuss how to close them. Germany will support this discussion. Let me now continue with thoughts on the second topic, social protection and social security. Again, based on the paper by DESA, let me say that having the means for a life in dignity is enshrined in many international and regional instruments, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, various ILO conventions, and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The path to achieve the fulfillment of the rights are as diverse as are the standards that define a life in dignity to be guaranteed by social protection flaws throughout the globe. As the report from the 2019 session points out, social protection is a very wide field encompassing items like welfare, livelihoods, affordable healthcare, social security, and social assistance, to name but a few. There is an interconnectedness of the right to social protection and social security with other human rights such as adequate standards of living, health, housing, and education. As the background paper recaps, in some systems, social protection flaws are at least to some part linked to participation in the labor market, in the life course, and good wages that lead to contributions. As we have learned from the first item, continuous development of skills in combination with formal education in younger years is important for the participation in the labor market. Thus, also essential for a better living in old age. So, the two items are interconnected. But looking at the life course, we should all bear in mind that in the majority of the countries, older women in their youth did not have the opportunity to achieve the same degree of education and thus often had less chances on the labor market with negative consequences for their social protection, which leads us to one of this year's main topics, displaying importance of intergenerational fairness. However, as last year of the pandemic has demonstrated so painfully, even if the field is wide, it is essential for the humankind that we ensure that vulnerable groups which have been hit hard by the pandemic are guaranteed a social protection floor, including access to affordable healthcare. The pandemic has also laid in the open how much we depend on care work done in the family. And this is an example of intergenerational solidarity par excellence. There's on the one hand, the care work that especially many older women deliver by caring for their grandchildren or partner. On the other hand, the care done by adult children for their aging parents in need for support. The study of OHCHR observes that there are extensive international human rights and ILO standards on the right to social protection and social security. However, there is still a lot of space to consider how some of these provisions may be better implemented in view of the major challenges and transformations impacting the world of work and old age-related policies and legal frameworks. The study also relates to issues regarding intergenerational fairness, which is of utmost importance in the field of social protection and social security. Let me at the end invite you all to tomorrow's side event where the OHCHR paper will be presented and discussed. In my opinion, this paper is a useful analysis of the existing international and regional legally binding norms and their implementation regarding the human rights of older persons. I hope that many of us will participate in this side event, that this working paper will move forward our in-depth discussion on possible implementations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. von Schwanenflügel, for highlighting and throwing down the gauntlet of the question. We know what the gaps, limitations, and deficiency are. What are we going to do about them, and how quickly? So I'm sure we're all looking forward to that side event tomorrow. I'd now like to move to our next panelist, and I'd like to call on Mr. Francisco Cevallos Tejadas. You have the floor.
Muy buenas tardes.
A very good afternoon to everyone in attendance. Let me start by thanking you for the invitation to take part in this panel discussion of this working group. Could you tell me, please, if you can see my presentation on screen? This is what I wish to speak to. Good, thank you. Now, in the world, older persons are growing by leaps and bounds. In 2018, for the first time in history, people over 65 were more than children under 5 years of age. And in only 2 decades, we will see a tripling of this number, whereas in 2019, 1 in every 11 persons were older, and 9% of the population. In 2050 will be 1 in every 4 persons. What does this mean? There's an increase in the proportion, a gradual, sequential, year-on-year increase in the number of older persons that are economically dependent, and we're seeing a wide diversity in this group of older persons. Many of them live in situations of poverty and extreme poverty, and we see progressive impoverishment of them. And we're also seeing this becoming more severe because of COVID-19. Older persons with disabilities, older persons who are on the move, of different ethnic origins, and in some cases, they are carrying degenerative diseases without any palliative care, inter alia. So these are just a few of the gaps and problems facing this population. So it is important to come up with adequate rights protection systems and care systems as well, which is what Matthias just mentioned in his presentation. The issue of care is now coming more to the fore. Now, there is no doubt that we also need a system of sustainable pensions, sustainable over time, and intervention models that are appropriate to this diversity of this demographic. The 4 A's that we see in the rights-based approach: availability, access to the services, and they have to be acceptable and adaptable services. And these must be appropriate for the persons. These are really important if we are to develop their rights. And along with that, I did also want to touch on the fact that there is an intergenerational approach that our policies need today. Now, although we are in this demographic transition, we also have to bear in mind that we already now have older persons that require measures, interdependent and complementary interventions different from the rest of the population, so that we can finance the care system for older persons. What does this mean? Well, we need public policies with an intergenerational approach that can accommodate this interdependence. On the one hand, because we have to sustain today's care systems for today's older persons today, but we also have to work on intergenerational policies, which also means that we have to think about those that will become older persons in the next few years or decades. So the result of all of that is that the policies today for the rest of the population not only require drive and sustenance for the care systems in place, but they also mean that we need to be able to come up with a way of ensuring that our older persons can age healthily. And the WHO and PAHO and others are calling for this kind of tangible step toward ensuring healthy aging. And these are just some of the measures taken now. So we, in the Ecuadorian context, came up with an organic law for older persons. And under this law, we are taking into account various principles and approaches that I'd like to share with you. One of this is the criterion of the cycle of life, lifespan, and how we can mainstream these intergenerational issues in each phase of everyone's life, so and focus on them. And in this specific case, we're looking at older persons. There is a programmatic framework, which is the National Development Plan, that also takes into account, and I wanted to refer to these very important issues for older persons, as this relates to lifelong learning, health, and more specifically, mental health, which we're seeing now. And I must also mention their social participation and participation as citizens. And how can we ensure that we can ensure that they recover or have more economic and social mobility, autonomy. And one of the forms of violence is family violence.
So as I was saying, we need national specialized systems to care for older persons. We need to get rid of barriers that they come up against. We need to get rid of discrimination, hatred, exploitation, violence and abuse that older persons can suffer from. We also need special protection systems to be in place, in particular when there are dual vulnerabilities at play for these people. And we also need to make sure that they are fully integrated in society and can fully participate in our societies. In terms of the programmatic framework that we have in Ecuador that alludes to the wider global agenda that there is, we have our National Development Plan in Ecuador, which is the framework that we use, and this allows us to it serves as a platform for an additional effort to be made by the state to protect older persons. And it also contains a range of policies and practices that we have that allow us to address some of the most pressing issues that I've already touched upon. And indeed, this includes the gaps that exist when it comes to achieving equality for older persons in society. For instance, we have a program called My Best Years.
Your slides don't seem to be coming through. Are you moving through them, or they're not coming up on the screen? Yep.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not. One moment. Can you see?
Yes, all good. Thank you. Sorry about the interruption.
So as I was saying, we have a program called My Best Years that focuses on 4 major areas. This includes favourable and healthy environments and care services for older persons. And we also have another area of work to ensure income security. In other words, how can we have a system that truly supports services and also fosters people's independence and autonomy? Thirdly, when it comes to skills and competences, as Matthias was just touching on, when it comes to lifelong education, for instance, how can we develop older persons' skills? And this can also include employability for older persons. And of course, the area of healthcare is an extremely important area. That means we must have robust health systems. This can include direct monetary transfers in countries with high levels of poverty or in middle-income countries where there is high levels of inequality. And I would just conclude with a good practice that we have seen in Ecuador, touching on the issue of COVID-19. We've come up with a protocol for protection for families who have young children, adolescents, or older persons, where the carer for those persons may have passed away or have been infected by COVID-19 and therefore had to isolate, or if older persons had become infected with COVID-19, what has been done is that we have set up a special protection system precisely for cases in which these carers were not able to carry out their duties normally as a result of perhaps an infection, or if the carer had passed away, and therefore the older persons were left more vulnerable. So that's the protocol we set up to respond to COVID-19 that has been rolled out in various regions and has been recognized by the Organization of American States. Some of the outcomes that we have seen from that initiative in the various local authorities in Ecuador who rolled out that protocol were very favorable. I won't go on any longer. I would just like to thank you very much for listening, and of course I'm available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very important reminder that intergenerational relations are critical to addressing the whole of the aging process and aging issues, and something I think which the paper before us makes clear is virtually absent from the international human rights framework. And I hope we'll come back to that later today. I'd now like to turn to our next panelists and to invite Ms. Barbara Mikovajic to take the floor. Professor Mikovajic.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning. I hope that everyone can hear me. Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. I thank you very much for letting me share my observations on older persons' digital education and international law. All these matters have been already discussed, so I may only support all the ideas of the DESA substantive input on inclusive education and capacity building. I am convinced that the digital inclusion should enhance the informative contexts content of older persons' rights. It should become a crucial part of the future provisions on lifelong learning and adult education. Despite considerable differences among states, all societies are evolving towards an information society, where digital skills are essential to be a full society member. But although the knowledge-based society is an aging society, the older generations are its weakest links in this case. It has been proved during the COVID-19 pandemic. Regardless of the country and standard of living, the percentage of people who are digitally excluded is highest for senior citizens. Not only due to a lack of internet access or funds, but also because of poor digital skills and low motivation to start learning. As it is stated in the substantive input, new technologies have a great potential for improving access to learning opportunities. Yes, but first, people should learn how to use them. Improving digital literacy is crucial for bridging the so-called great digital divide. Modern society needs lifelong learning in the ICT area, as the practical usefulness of any knowledge once required becomes outdated very quickly. All these matters should be considered in the context of the human right to education, understood in its broadest sense. Of course, the right to education has many faces. In this case, access to the internet and its relevant infrastructure and affordability of age-friendly devices are essential elements. But suitable and acceptable digital education for older people appears to be a more significant challenge today, also to the international community. Indeed, there are crucial soft law to milestone regional treaties and other regional and global initiatives covering also ICT issues. But without older persons' own universal convention, their rights are still vague in current international human rights law. Certainly, the international community has developed many regulations directly or indirectly relating to various aspects of human right to education. But the scope of older persons' educational rights, also in the digital sphere, are difficult to identify. We should remember that the relevant instruments were mainly adopted when the principal challenges in education focused on eliminating illiteracy and providing children with primary schooling. At that time, there was no internet and no one considered digital skills. and the problem of global aging was not such a burning issue as it is today. In international documents, older persons, especially those who have left the labor market, are seldom associated with education and even much less with digital issues. This is easy to ascertain when we check the Universal Human Rights Index. It does not match older persons as a group of concern with the notions of digital literacy or computers. The index connects older people as one of many vulnerable groups with education, but far less frequently with lifelong learning, information and communication technology, digital skills, digital divide, and the internet. The index also shows that the concluding observations of the human rights treaty bodies and recommendations made by states within the UPR process connect these matters with older persons to a minimal extent. For example, in last years, just a few times, the human rights treaty bodies had an opportunity to express their concern regarding older persons excluded from digital public services. So there is a need for a fresh impetus. The new binding global norms on older persons' right to education should keep pace with demographic and technological changes. They should follow the UNESCO approach, focusing more on the idea of learning to be also after retirement. This also means the support for civil society initiatives, intergenerational learning, and various modalities of education. They should be accessible and free from ageism and age discrimination, because, paraphrasing, old dogs also have the right to learn new, here digital tricks. The new instruments would result in the consolidation of solutions scattered over many documents. It also helps in consolidation internal policies of states and raise global awareness. Finally, adoption of an international standard which takes into account the needs of older persons may become a win-win action. If a state respects, protects, and fulfills obligations arising from provision on older persons' right to education, covering digital issues, it will get more active, better informed, and more independent society members. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mikovacic. And now you've stressed the very important issues about general provisions and the lack of specificity not doing the job that we need to in the area of education, and highlighted, I think, the importance, obviously, of digital education, but the whole question of ageism in these areas, as well as other areas that I also hope we might come back to in the discussion. So it's now So I'd now like to call on the next panelist, Mr. Marvin Formosa. Mr. Formosa, you have the floor.
Good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on which time zone you are. Chair, colleagues, being last on the panel, of course, meant that many of the points which I wanted to raise have been raised by the excellent speakers before me. And so I had to improvise a little bit whilst I was listening to the very excellent presentations by Matthias, Francisco, and Barbara. So I jotted a number of points which perhaps have not yet been asserted so far. I mean, I come from Malta, where the office of INEA is based in Malta, and of course Malta is a European Union member state, and as we all know, lifelong learning is very central, very integral to the European Union. In fact, it's a policy which is found in all the time and everywhere. It's ubiquitous. But of course, Other lifelong learning tends to overlook older people. So the first policy paper on lifelong learning was in 1995 in the European Union, but the first time that older people were mentioned was in 2006, 11 years after. Almost an afterthought. And basically, I think it was an afterthought because after 2006, then nothing again. Lifelong learning is a subject which is very close to my heart, and basically my mantra is that human rights do not become obsolete with age. On the contrary, because of the various vulnerabilities that the previous panelists have mentioned, I believe that there should be affirmative action. And putting words into action, Malta has a number of policies on what we call older adult learning or late life learning. First and foremost, we have two main policies that address this issue. One policy is on lifelong learning, where there's a specific chapter on older people. And on the other hand, we have a national strategy for active aging, in which a specific chapter is on lifelong learning. So both the Ministry of Education, the ministry responsible for older persons, we have a ministry solely responsible for older persons, it's called the Ministry for Older Persons and Active Aging, tend to invest a lot of time and energy. Basically, the ministry does a lot of outreach towards older people, whilst on the other hand, the University of Malta and even other non-governmental agencies have specific late life learning programs, such as, for example, we no longer speak of day centers for active aging, but we speak of lifelong learning hubs. And we also speak of pre-retirement education, because it's important that people are given the right skills, and not solely vocational skills, but psychological skills in order to live for as much as 4 decades in later life. Something which is also close to our policy, which is also integral to our policy, is diversity. And we all know that usually the people who tend to enroll in older adult learning are those people who have already benefited a lot in lifelong learning in previous life stages, basically middle class older women, which basically means that a number of sectors are invisible in lifelong learning in later life. For example, persons who come from a low socioeconomic background, men, especially men, we all know that 80% of participants in lifelong learning are women, persons who live in rural areas, and others like people from the LGBT community, ethnic minorities. So basically, we have this wide participation agenda whereby we have male-friendly lifelong learning programs in areas which are very much working class, and lifelong learning programs in rural areas. At the same time, we also try, or I think we have succeeded in not being fourth ageist. What is fourth ageist? What is fourth ageism? It's basically neglecting, overlooking older people who are in the fourth age, who because of levels of frailty, they cannot participate in community older adult learning. So basically, older persons who are homebound and who live in care homes. So in Malta, we have, it only exists in Malta. It's called the University of the Fourth Age. Everybody knows what the University of the Third Age is. The University of the Fourth Age is basically lifelong learning programs for older people who are housebound, who are homebound, who cannot leave their houses. Others who are residents in long-term care communities, and also persons with dementia. So we have specific lifelong learning programs for persons with dementia, which basically runs in parallel with the United Nations Victim of Leaving No One Behind. We have also heard about the COVID and its effects. I will just say one thing, that it's not true that we are online now. We are all online now, because as I believe all the previous panelists said, that when the digital divide between young and older people is very strong. Another comment which I wanted to put across is, of course, we shouldn't forget the concept of a society for all ages. So intergenerational learning is very important. It's very important to have both learning opportunities for older persons on their own, because they do enjoy having programs which just cater for 60 plus people, but they also enjoy being with other younger people, or perhaps with even older people. And finally, one final point that I would like to put across is that lifelong learning for older people will not be achieved by an add-on effect. So basically, we cannot add what we know about adults and children and implant it on older people. So a concept which perhaps is not so much popular or readily known by many is the concept of geragogy. So we have pedagogy, which everybody knows about, andragogy, so basically the teaching and learning of adults, but there is also geragogy. So basically, something that we do in MOTA is that we train facilitators who teach, are involved in lifelong learning with older people in this concept of geragogy. Of course, it's not unique. It does have overlaps with andragogy and pedagogy, but there is also some uniqueness about this. Well, I'll give back the floor to the chair, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Formosa, and thank you. Among the many points you made, I think it's important to pull out one which hasn't come up so much thus far. That's the whole importance of intersectionality and recognizing the needs of diverse groups and the aging experience of different groups as under international human rights law and, of course, in educational policy, and your important emphasis on the whole question of ageism, which earlier panelists have also mentioned. It's now time for us to move to the interactive discussion, and I will open the floor for comments and questions to the panelists, and would encourage you to keep your interventions short and focused, and to refrain, if possible, from reading prepared statements. And I think it'd be very helpful, given that we have these terrifically detailed papers which pull together a range of appropriate normative elements, to perhaps reflect on the question of whether how we move with them. There's general agreement, I think, on many of the issues. What do we do with them? How do we package them in a new instrument or better procedures to move forward with our common knowledge? So far as the interventions go, the time limits are 3 minutes for national statements and 5 minutes for statements on behalf of groups of states. Same time limit of 3 minutes applies to statements by national human rights institutions and non-governmental organisations. Now, participants wishing to take the floor are requested to inscribe by clicking the link to the inscription form. And I think the Secretariat has or is now about to post that link in the chat box. So please make sure you get onto that list. I'd also like to remind participants that they won't be able to unmute their microphones or engage their video unless they are given the floor. And when you're called upon to speak, you'll receive a message saying that your streaming is approved. Please press the video button appearing in that message in order to share your video and audio. And once again, if you experience any technical difficulties when sharing your video and audio, we will attempt to give you the floor again at a later point, and a technical focal point will reach out to you. So let me turn then to the list of speakers. And the first two speakers I have on my list are the National Human Rights Institute of Finland and Mexico. So first of all, I'd like then to give the floor to the Human Rights Centre of Finland. You have the floor.
Thank you. I hope you're hearing me correctly.
Okay, yes.
Okay, excellent. So, Madam Chair, Excellencies, experts, ladies and gentlemen, The Finnish NHRI wishes to thank the UN Open-Ended Working Group for Aging for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion on normative elements of social protection and social security. The protection and promotion of the rights of older persons is a very important priority of the Finnish National Human Rights Institution. Let me first share some information on the legal framework in place in Finland with regard to affordability and accessibility of care. The Section 19 of our Constitution guarantees the rights to social security. It states that everyone shall be guaranteed the right to basic subsistence in the event of unemployment, illness, and disability, and during old age, as well as at the birth of a child or loss of a provider. And the public authorities shall guarantee to everyone adequate social, health, and medical services. These rights are further specified in social and health legislation. But despite this comprehensive legislation, there are gaps in social protection of older people and the right to social security. It's not always fully realized. Specific areas of concern in Finland are the affordability and availability of care, especially long-term care for older persons. Our government has taken steps to address these shortcomings by amendments made on some acts. However, these changes made do not apply to community-based services for older persons. We did conduct a survey in our NHRI in 2021. That is a few weeks ago we finished. And according to that survey, approximately 10% of the persons who were over 70 years of age still lived at their own homes and received municipal services, did not get sufficient assistance. They reported, though, having been offered more services during the COVID-19 pandemic than before it. So this seems to indicate that municipalities have made efforts to take care of older persons during the pandemic. A couple of words on participation. The Finnish legislation requires the municipalities to draw up a plan on measures to support the well-being and health of older population, as well as to organize and develop the services and informal care. Municipalities must also establish a council for older people to ensure the participation of older population. And the councils are included in the preparation of the above-mentioned plan and its evaluation, and are to be provided the opportunity to influence the decision-making in the municipalities. Well, we made another survey in 2020 where nearly half of these municipal councils for older persons stated they do not have sufficient possibilities to influence municipal planning and decision-making processes, and thus promote the well-being of older persons in the municipalities. These problems were worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic, since remote meetings were not always possible for members of those councils due to lack of equipment and ICT and digital skills. So these findings confirm that there is still a long way to go to ensure effective participation of older persons in matters concerning their life. Too often, older people are considered as objects rather than active rights holders capable of participation and self-determination. What I would like to ask the panelists would be if they feel there should be some international action, more international action on promoting the digital skills of older persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if perhaps we can take that question on notice, and we'll come back to the panelists after a few more interventions. And thank you for putting questions to the panelists, and I hope that others will endeavour to do that as well. So let me then invite the representative of Mexico, followed by the National Human Rights Commission of the Philippines to speak. Mexico, you have the floor.
Gracias. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I really would like to thank the panelists and country representatives that have shared their views, from which we have learned a lot. I wanted to mention some of the progress that we have made in Mexico in terms of the rights of older persons. The most important goal of the government in its fourth transformation in 2050, we're seeing them enjoy welfare. We recognize the potential contributions and potential of older persons to the diversity of their communities and the economic and political development of our country and the right of them to dignified aging. And we're also trying to ensure the economic security of people over 60 and 65 in indigenous populations through the universal non-contributive pension, and we see this as a constitutional right since March 2020. In 2021, we have been providing for 8.5 million older persons with this pension. This means that every 2 months they receive $135, and the budget, I'm sorry, I haven't converted it to dollars, but it's 136 billion pesos by the end of March 2021. That is to say, a few weeks ago, the president mentioned that the pension would be as of 65 years old, and this would be universally applied. And at the end of this government in 2024, it will be almost doubled. That is to say, almost $300 every 2 months. We are also guaranteeing the right to health, and we're doing this through the INSABID, or Health and Welfare Institute, since 2020, providing free health care of high quality for everyone in the country and that do not have social security. And the criteria applied are universality, inclusion, and equality. We have equipped many hospitals, and we have hired a great deal of medical practitioners trained in geriatric and gerontology. I should also mention that the country was left behind when it came to health. For many years, we did not have enough medical personnel, and we have made great progress in this over the past few months as we seek to close these gaps. We're hiring many practitioners, not just doctors and nurses. And the National Institute for Older Persons, NAPAM, is coming up with a culture of active aging, which is interculturally, non-discriminatory, and rights-based. We're trying to make our public service aging friendly as well and mainstream it in public policies. And we're participating in a national care system for older persons. And we're proposing to come up with a general law for the protection of the rights of older persons. And this would be linked to the Inter-American Convention for the Protection of the Human Rights of Older Persons. We have sought to set up councils for older persons across the country, and the idea was to strengthen them as rights holders and to make sure that they enjoy their full dignity as full-fledged members of the society. I really wanted to thank you for the opportunity to share these experiences with you, and I hope that we will all continue to learn from each other in this event. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico, and I hope that at some stage we might be able to discuss a little bit more the impetus, the stimulus that the Inter-American Convention has given generally to developments in this area, and also particularly in the areas that we're speaking about in this panel. So I'd now like to call on the National Human Rights Commission of the Philippines, followed by Argentina. So National Human Rights Commission of the Philippines, you have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yes. Good day and good evening to the distinguished chair, moderator, panelists, and participants. The Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines is pleased to address this and provide inputs on social protection. For the Philippines, while we acknowledge the country as having a great number of pension schemes in Asia, the country is one of the lowest in the region in terms of coverage. The country's pension system is also fragmented, and each of the existing pension schemes has varying laws, administration, conditions, and benefits. Studies have found that older persons use their pensions not only for their needs but also for other members of their household, most especially their grandchildren. While the pension may have made a major difference, older people facing high levels of vulnerability, it is still far from providing a decent level of income that ensures older persons can meet their basic needs. During this pandemic, the distribution of social amelioration programs in the Philippines and other similar programs in other countries have helped ease the financial burden of older persons. However, post-COVID-19 measures.
Sorry, Marizanne, I'm sorry to intervene. I'm getting a technical message from the interpreters saying they're having a bit of trouble with the connection. So they're going to troubleshoot your connection, and then we'll come back to you for you to complete the statement. I'm sorry about the interruption. That we obviously want to get everyone to receive your message. So they will deal with you offline. And in the sorry about that. And in the meantime, can I call on the representative of Argentina, please, to take the floor?
Buenas tardes.
A very good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Moderator. The presentations have been extremely interesting. Just touching on what I have heard from the various panelists, I would just like to say that in Argentina, state policies are based on the Inter-American Convention on the Protection of the Human Rights of Older Persons. This is an instrument that we have had since 2015, and it means that the right to education for older persons has been more greatly disseminated, and all state bodies take it as a policy. But it also means that we've been able to roll out training and awareness-raising programs to break down prejudices and myths. Going back to what the panelist from Germany said about the need for a specific framework to guarantee lifelong learning possibilities, I just wanted to reflect on that and mention the possibility, or even the necessity, to have a universal convention for the rights of older persons as soon as possible. And this would include the right to lifelong learning and education and training, vocational training for all persons working with older persons. And also this would include awareness-raising campaigns to break down barriers and prejudices about old age. This situation, the current situation, is one that we would like to improve, and we think that that would be a positive step. I also wish to mention the urgent need, as I say, for a universal convention, including this lifelong education possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the representative of Argentina. What I'd like to do now, before going on to the next speaker, is to give the panelists a chance to respond to, in particular, to the last intervention by Argentina, but also to the earlier question by the National Human Rights Institution of Finland. And I suppose there are two issues that one or more of the panelists might like to comment on. One is do we need to do more in relation to digital education? I think the answer is, is fairly clear there. But the question is, what would it look like? What would that framework about lifelong education and about better access to digital education by older persons look like? Would it belong, would it work in a special thematic instrument on the rights of older persons? Does it have to be placed elsewhere? What is going to make the difference, and what would it look like in your opinions? I might start, I think, if I may, with Professor Mikołajczyk, and then go to any of the other panelists who wishes to comment on that. So, Professor Mikołajczyk.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for the comments and the questions. I think
okay, we have you back now.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comments. I think that all the possible measures should be consolidated because of the lack of awareness. I think that in area of education, older persons are really invisible. I would like to provide one example. In Poland, we have a very good example of intergenerational learning. Some cities introduced the program Grandchildren Teach Grandparents, and it works. And I think that in this context, we should also remember about the cities, municipalities, and small villages. And I think that the local government is really very important. And I think that we are missing this point here, because all the persons are usually very close to the place when they are living. So I think that maybe some ideas about support for municipalities should be introduced into the convention, the future convention. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Mr. von Schwanenflügel, did you wish to comment on that? I think you hit the mic, no?
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I think thank you very much for the comments by the NHRIs. Talking about a framework, I think we should discuss it in the light of the OHCHR paper and the DESA paper. And those two papers are really well done and will help us a lot. And as Argentina said, the NHRI from Argentina said, awareness raising is one of the crucial instruments. We have to make sure, we have to make clear to the whole society that lifelong learning is crucial for everyone. And it doesn't stop when you first get your pension, or it doesn't stop when you leave university. So it's a task for the whole life. And that's what we see in the pandemic at the moment, that it is really crucial. And but for many people, going back to school at the age of 65 or 70, it's not that easy. So the courses and the education has to be a kind of low threshold courses, so that everybody wants to also that more people want to join it, and don't fear that they go back to school. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Formosa, did you want to comment at this stage or come back later? No, I take.
Are you hearing me? Yes.
No, you're coming.
Okay.
Yes, okay, please go ahead.
Yes. I would like to comment on the issue raised by, I believe, the representative of Argentina when the topic of ICT and the age digital divide was mentioned. And the problem with attempts to so-called skill older people in ICT is twofold. I mean, first, there's the challenge that um, usually we tend to approach older people as if they were a homogeneous group. And we don't really cater for the heterogeneity of older persons. So it's usually we only cater for those older people who show an interest or who are courageous enough to apply to learn more about ICT. But the majority of older people do not feel confident to come forward, do not feel ready to attend the class, and therefore there must be the second issue, a lot of outreach work. So we should not await older persons to knock on our door, but we need to go out in the field, so to speak, and reach them there. And also, and we also need particular approaches in our attempts to skill older people in ICT. We cannot just implement programs which have been developed with adults in a lock, stock, and barrel fashion, but we need to take a very age-friendly approach.
Thank you very much. I think Mr. Cevallos Tejada, you wanted to intervene as well. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I wanted to take up a couple of the questions that were asked. The first one has to do with digital inclusion for older persons. There is no doubt. I believe that the major umbrella here is inclusion across the board, which would also include digital, especially when the entire world has now become fully and so quickly digitalized since the pandemic. So digital inclusion is important, but we also have to bear in mind something else. Along with digital inclusion, we also have to develop not just connectivity, but we have to know how to use technology, but also use the content of the technology, because with the digitalization of societies, we're seeing that this is promoting citizenry and access to information, but there's also risk being generated for older persons, children, and adolescents, because they might find themselves facing risks as a result of the digital environment they're interacting with. And this is linked to education. The education system has to teach us to discern between the types of information we have to see what is true and what is false, because digitalization across the board for everyone, including older persons, with these stresses related to content, can also generate more risk for this population. Now, UNESCO has an international conference that deals with education for older persons, where education for young adults is their agenda. But meetings such as this working group's meeting means that we have to dialogue with other UN entities and other entities, especially when it comes to education for older persons. The major problem faced in many of our countries is the issue of illiteracy. And illiteracy is usually targeting mostly women, indigenous people, and older persons. This is the most severely affected group by illiteracy. So as a result of this, education initiatives for older persons must absolutely include these unique features and address these specific characteristics. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to return to our list of speakers. And the Philippines is back. So I'd like to invite the National Human Rights Commission of the Philippines to once again take the floor. Roseanne.
Hi. Sorry about a while ago. I hope this fully goes through. Thank you again for letting us speak at this session. We will provide our inputs on social protection. For the Philippines, while we acknowledge the country is having a great number of pension schemes in Asia, it is, however, one of the lowest in the region in terms of coverage. The country's pension system is also fragmented, and each of the existing pension schemes has varying laws, administration, conditions, and benefits. Studies have found that older persons use their pensions not only for their needs, but also for the other members of their households, most especially their children. While the pension may have made a major difference to older people facing high levels of vulnerability, it is still far from providing a decent level of income that ensures older people can meet their basic needs. During this pandemic, the distribution of social amelioration programs in the Philippines and similar programs in other countries have helped ease the financial burden of older persons. However, post-COVID-19 measures should closely look at non-contributory social pensions. A comprehensive pension system is critical not only to support dignity in later life, but as part of a broader strategy to tackle poverty and inequality. It bears emphasizing that a comprehensive pension system is especially needed more during these times of emergency, such as this pandemic.
Yeah,
The state.
Marizette, I'm sorry, I'm getting another message from the technical team. We're going to have to park you again, and they're suggesting you might want to get headphones, but I'll refer you back to them. I'm sorry once again. It's the day problems with remote meetings.
Yeah, is it still static, or is there something
I believe so. I understand. What
interfering?
message I'm getting is that the audio coming through the interpreters isn't good enough for them to interpret. So headphones might be the answer. But probably best if I refer you to the technical team and keep going and hope to get you back. If not, we'll have the benefit of your written statement, I believe. But hopefully we'll see.
Yeah, but can I pose one question though for the panelists? If I won't be back, I hope they can discuss the International Treaty on Older Persons and how it can close the protection
Thank you.
gap.
And just for the interpreters, the question that the representative of the Philippines NHRI wanted to ask is what about an international convention, and how and will it close the international protection gap in these areas, which is, I think, a central question. So thank you. We hope to see you back, but if not, thank you for your intervention.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew.
Speaker on my the next speaker on my list is HelpAge Deutschland. You have the floor.
Hello. Dear Vice Chair, dear Moderator, dear colleagues, this is a statement by HelpAge Deutschland on social protection, especially old age pensions. Let me first start by thanking Amal and Rio for this very instructive DESA and OHCHR paper, which indeed is very instructive, and I can easily link up with it. So my statement is on old age pensions. So we know older persons need a pension, but we also know that contributory social insurance pensions only apply to formal workers, and they also have a gender bias. Therefore, non-contributory pensions have been introduced in the South, so-called social pensions, but only half of the southern countries have such a social pension. Actually, we just learned Mexico is one of those countries. Moreover, the existing social pensions are deficient in many ways. For example, benefits tend to be low. So both availability and adequacy are impaired. How come? One reason is a massive gap in extant legal instruments. We know that the right to Social Security is laid down in Article 9 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. But this article is the shortest article in the Covenant. It defines no benefit standard and only names one instrument, namely social insurance. Why is this so? The article was worded more than half a century ago, at a time when non-contributory pensions were not on global agendas. To conclude, Help Deutschland calls for a convention on the rights of older persons, which defines the right to social security in a more substantial way by defining benefit standards and including non-contributory pensions. Last word, we talked a lot about digitalization. Actually, there's a link because access to social pensions is increasingly digitalized, which on the one hand may enable more persons to have access. On the other hand, this raises the issues which we discussed, namely to enable older persons to use digital access. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the representative of Help Deutschland. I'd now like to call on the UN independent expert on the human rights of older persons, Dr. Claudia Mahler. Dr. Mahler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. I would like to thank the panelists for their informative presentations, and I'm glad that we have some time to discuss the normative elements which would give us some food for thought, how we can specify the rights for older persons to make them work in practice. Today we discussed in different side events ageism and age discrimination, which have negative impacts on older persons and the enjoyment of their human rights, especially on the rights to education and the right to lifelong learning. From my perspective, we also need to address other forms of discrimination and the problems of recognizing intersectionality and international human rights law, which is still missing. Because I've spoken so much already today, I would like to ask a question to the panelists. The paper states that in relation to education, that although current standards on adult education may include older persons by default, the lack of a specific reference means that there are shortfalls in practice. Do you think a specific instrument supported by a regular reporting procedure could more effectively bring the issue to the attention of the policymakers? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahler. And I think that's a good point to actually pause and go back to our panelists on the issue of intersectionality. I think the other interesting statement in the background paper, or the working paper on the normative elements, as well as the OHCHR paper, but is the problems with intersectionality within the system, in particular paragraph 14 of the paper on the normative elements, which says that gender and age intersections are, I quote, beyond the scope of existing standards. So I'd be interested to follow up on the independent expert's question on the panelists' thoughts on how we get to deal adequately with the various forms of intersectional discrimination that older persons face. Who wants to start with that? Professor Mikovacic, would you like to address that? I know you've written on some aspects of that. I'm not hearing you just yet, I don't think. I'm not hearing you. I'm afraid, Professor Mikovacic, we're not hearing you yet. We'll have to try one of the other panelists and come back to you. Sorry about that. So one of the others. Let me start with Mr. Formosa. Would you like to address the issue of intersectionality, or not hearing.
Yes. Okay.
Okay,
You're
thank you.
hearing me?
Yes, yes, excellent.
Well, intersectionality is, of course, sometimes it's like the elephant in the room. I mean, it's always there, but people prefer not to see it or to put it under the carpet if it wasn't an elephant. So yes, intersectionality is very important because, first of all, it puts into the picture the issue of double, triple jeopardies, because of course all the people may be vulnerable. All of the people are vulnerable because of ageism, but women may be also vulnerable because of sexism. So we've got the double jeopardy of ageism and sexism. But there are triple jeopardies like ethnic minorities, people living in rural areas, the LGBTIQ sector, and therefore the mistake that policy tends to do is to, like what I've said before, is to forget about the intersectional vulnerabilities and approach other persons from a homogeneous point of view, from a normative point of view. There are also questions about whether a convention would help other persons in achieving or in maintaining their rights, which I believe yes, or every instrument, every policy which is available, of course, is always a step forward, but it's not easy. It's not easy because ageism is entrenched in our habits, it's entrenched in our perspective of life. So about intersectionality, to go to the point, I think we should also work from bottom up as well, not just top bottom. So top bottom works, but it should also be complemented from a bottom up approach. So NGOs should also promote diversity, intersectionality, and different ways of growing older.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd now like to try to return to Professor Kovacic. Do you want to take the floor again, please? Let's hope that it all works. And it's not looking good. We can't hear you again. You may need to reset all lines and come back later, I think, is the technical approach. Mr. von Schwanenflügel or no, Mr. Cevallos Tejada, do you want to comment on the intersectionality issue?
Hola, sí.
Yes, I would like to. First of all, when we talk about intersectionality and all of these words beginning with inter, we are talking about problems that have many different causes, and so our approach has to be as broad as the problems are, if you like, interdisciplinary, intersectional, because when we look at intersectionality, we'll find that there are historic gaps that different parts of the population have encountered over history. I was talking about illiteracy a minute ago. This is an issue that affects older people, women, people in rural areas, indigenous people, in particular in Latin America. So intersectionality is a fundamental approach if we are to have if we are to come up with comprehensive solutions. Next, on whether or not we need an international convention to encourage states to submit reports on how they uphold the rights of older persons, I think that is absolutely essential. I think having an Inter-American Convention has been of crucial importance to countries in my region. And so I think it is an effort that could be replicated globally to encourage states, because we've seen how initiatives have been developed at the regional level. So if we had such a framework at a global level, and if it were binding as well, then it would certainly be a way of moving the issue forward, because it would highlight the importance of the issue at the global level.
Them and the panelists can come back later with any comments. I'd now like to call on the representative of the Too Young to Retire Pass It On network, please. You have the floor.
Here we are. Thank you very much. I represent the Global Pass It On Network of Positive Aging Advocates that was created by the Paris-based NGO Too Young to Retire. I want to say first, I admire the work of the DESA in the DESA statement. I think that, as Rio summarized it, the emphasis on the 4 A's provide criteria by which we can look at how we're going to be approaching the assortment of rules that and regulations that will be needed in policies if we're going to be moving ahead, and certainly we wish to move ahead. I also would like to praise the work of the comments about Andrew Burns about the importance of lifelong skills development. For those of us who have late life careers, it's essential that we not only have digital skills training and literacy, but also are able to keep up in touch with those opportunities that are available to us in entrepreneurship or in employment. The goal of education, from my perspective, is preparing all of us to become lifelong learners, empowering our self-determination, which we know is vitally important to older adults worldwide. Excuse me. I do want to say that when we began our own Pass It On Network's normative statement, we talked about as a how-to opening up and spreading out higher education. We talked about a lifelong learning framework that would encourage portable credentials that move with the student, varied ways for students to attend classes, and more support through advisors and coaches, financial aid, and life work planning. But COVID came along, and now it's obvious that it's drawn our attention away from classrooms, excuse me, to the potential for life work education for older persons in both developed and developing countries via a plentiful variety of webinars and videos and databases, if all residents have smartphones or tablets with affordable access to electric power, perhaps solar power, and the internal and some technical support. So here we are. This is what I think needs to happen. We need to codify the rights of all older persons to 21st century education that will benefit all ages. Some people say, if what you're talking about is for everybody, we don't need to have a special convention for older people. The need for a convention was illustrated a week ago when the presidents of 38 universities in the US convened a task force on higher education and opportunity. They have focused on expanding opportunity across huge social and economic opportunity gaps, but there was no attention given in their agenda to the second half of life. This is the problem. Even those people from higher education were focusing on the typical view of education as being elementary, secondary, post-secondary, for degrees, etc. We're beyond that now. We have tremendous potential in both developing as well as developed countries. And by the way, I was 69 years old when I received my PhD in 2001, which is focused in gerontology, and has since co-founded a couple of networks in the US as well as the global Pass It On network. But my goal is to keep on advocating for you guys to, for the Working Group on Aging, to find the resources in order to be able to codify these rights and get them in front of the UN General Assembly through the steps that would be taken in between, so that within my lifetime, I'm going to get to see the rights actually stated. I've been following the work of the Working Group on Aging a long time, it seems, and we need to move ahead. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we seem to have a technical issue. We are in the process of resolving the connection to our distinguished moderator. It seems that the connection is now reestablished. Mr. Moderator, back to you. Mr. Moderator, we cannot hear you. Very sorry, we still cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, bear with us just for a few seconds whilst we attempt to re-establish the connection.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Mr. Moderator, we cannot hear you.
Okay.
It seems we're getting some sound, but not a lot.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try. Perhaps we can call on the next speaker. I think is the
We can hear you now.
Information Center. I think
we can hear you now.
I don't have access to the list of speakers, but I think it's the Resource Information Center, which is the next speaker. So you have the floor. No? Please proceed.
Representative of the Resource Integration Center, your sound is coming through. If you switch on your video, all should work. Mr. Moderator, you're muted. Mr. Moderator, you're still muted. I'll take the floor and give it back to you again. Bear with me. Mr. Moderator, we have given you the floor. Mr. Moderator, we can see you, not hear you.
Distinguished delegates and panelists and colleagues, I will step in until we reestablish the connection with the moderator. I would like to give the floor to the next speaker, which is the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care. You have the floor, please.
Yes? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I on?
Yes, we hear you.
I'm on. Good. Super. Thank you. Health systems everywhere are completely unprepared for aging populations. These are the populations who have actually benefited from public health measures and advances in infection control that allow them to live longer, often with chronic and so-called non-communicable diseases. Lifelong learning and social protection are key to this demographic shift, as both those suffering from chronic diseases and their caregivers need to learn new nursing and digital skills. Caregivers and patients also need social protection following a diagnosis of serious illness when they are forced to leave employment. Only a handful of rich countries provide palliative care stipends for caregivers. In this day and age, following COVID and during COVID, these need to be universal. Caregivers who have left jobs, the vast majority of whom are women, often older women, need to have their employment kept open for them and their Social Security paid while they are caregiving until they can return to work. COVID has revealed, as we have heard since yesterday and knew before, how states have abandoned their older populations, particularly those in congregate settings and those living alone. So-called developed countries had the highest rates of nursing home deaths, as we heard this morning, sending in the army to remove the bodies of those who died unattended. This massacre of the elderly, as a high-ranking Vatican official put it recently, must not be allowed to happen again. Health systems must integrate palliative care as an essential service, along with prevention, promotion, treatment, and rehabilitation. Yet health services that address serious illness, dying, and caregiving are stigmatized, gendered, and underpaid compared to specialties that save, quote unquote, lives and reduce preventable mortality, which is the metric in global health. The normative framework exists now at the global level to support states developing palliative care as a component of primary health care and ensuring adequate access to essential palliative care medicines for the treatment of pain and symptoms. These are lacking in more than 70% of the world, a violation of the rights of all people to the highest attainable standard of health, and to freedom from cruel and inhumane treatment. The former independent expert, Ms. Rosa Kornfeld-Mate, called this deficit out several times in her reports and public statements. The International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care has submitted a paper on the normative and technical elements of a right to palliative care for older persons to the Secretariat. Such a right should be included in any binding convention, which we should support, and begin with all deliberate speed on drafting. I thank you.
Madam Chair, I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry about that and the disruption. We have two speakers and about 5 minutes for a wrap up from the panelists as well. So could I ask the two speakers, the NHRI from Poland, Office of the Human Rights Commission from Poland, and NS India Giza organization to briefly comment. First of all, Poland. NHRI Poland.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today on behalf of the Commissioner for Human Rights of Poland. The main issue I'd like to highlight today is the need to shift the perception of the right to education from social rights to human rights, and the need of introducing normative content of the right, as we still observe the lack of implementing the right in practice. In Poland, educational opportunities for older persons are described more in terms of social rights aimed at fighting against poverty, but not as a universal right that should be fulfilled. Currently, the state's activity regarding education of older persons is still presented in Polish SDGs reports as a part of the Goal 1 on reducing poverty. This gives the false impression that educational opportunities are addressed to older persons vulnerable to social exclusion only, or that the whole population of senior citizens is vulnerable in this regard, which is also not true. This kind of approach doesn't embrace the diversity among older persons. There is nothing about education of older persons under the Goal 4, which refers to quality education for all. And this issue is also elaborated in broader scope in the new update analysis of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was already mentioned earlier at the session, and as well as in report of the independent expert on the human rights of older persons. And the details of the report are in the written version of my statement. I really would like to underline the need that at this stage we must therefore talk about necessary shift in perception of this right, which would result in building a systemic approach to that will make education in older age accessible in every local community. This should be achieved after introducing the rights-based approach to education in older age. As in the previous century, our societies built an educational system for children and youth. Now it is time to develop accessible educational opportunities also for people in older age. Therefore, introducing education in older age as a human right in the new possible convention would be a game changer also in Poland. And I would like, if it's possible, I would request the panelists to comment on the shift from the perspective of the right from social right to human right, and how can it be achieved as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And our final speaker before the panelists, who will have, I think, 1 minute each to make a final comment and response. Apologise for the shortness of time. NS India Giza organisation, you have the floor. Yes, India Giza organization. Yes, okay.
Yes. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm speaking on the name of Sindagiza, saying that the right to education is a human right and indispensable for exercise of other human rights and at the heart of the SDGs. In Rwanda, Rwanda literacy in 2018 was 70%. As the progress in education was strengthened less than 20 years back, most of those who were not able to go to school are in their old age now. So while there are policies of education for all, inclusive education, ICT in education, and education for girls, they do not formally discriminate. Formal education is mostly for children and youth with no specific program for education training and capacity building for other people. Education in Rwanda before 2009 was in Kinyarwanda and French at all levels. It has shifted from French to English from primary school with the promotion of ICT. Now the country has become Anglophone. The gap here is that other people and the others who started before 2010 are lost and feel frustrated due to the e-system and the use of English in everything. So key information is provided through social media and is mostly English, which causes other people to feel illiterate even though they were in school. What I can say is that a key normative element of the right to education in old age is that education must be acceptable and adaptable to their requirements. Other people have the right to equal access to opportunities of lifelong learning, education, skills building available to the general public and to learning opportunities adapted to their specific needs, including their language and community needs. So as a solution, the reason behind the above issue is that there is no binding international legal instrument that directs funding and data on education, lifelong learning, training, and capacity building for other people as an excuse to not put in place the necessary legal and policy framework. Now is the time for an international convention on all the human rights of other people, including their right to education adapted to their specific requirements. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. And now where time is almost up, and I'd like to seek clarification from the chair. Do we have a moment for a quick final comment from each of the panelists, Madam Chair? Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I think yes. We can wrap up quickly.
Okay. Thank you. In which case, let's go through in the order in which we started. Mr. von Schwanenflügel, do you have a final brief message for us?
I'd like to point out two things. First, I want to go back to the question of the independent expert regarding the shortfalls regarding intersectionality. I fully agree with what Marvin Formosa said, that we have to have an approach bottom-up, and it has to be very diverse. And a second thing I would like to point out, the covenant covers the human rights as we discussed it, but we have to have in mind that the covenant was implemented many years ago, and during a time when we didn't have any ICT, when we didn't have an internet and computers on every table. So that's one thing when we look at when we talk about normative elements, that we have to have in mind that times have changed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now move to our second panelist, Mr. Cevallos for a brief final comment, if you wish.
Thank you. When it comes to the Latin American region, we can't talk about education without it being enshrined as a human right. That is crucial for our region. And so that is, I think, a fundamental issue for all countries, in fact. Education should be a basic human right. But of course, it's also connected to other economic, social, and cultural rights for people. So this, if the rights to education is upheld, then it will have economic repercussions as well. And that cannot be denied. And this is particularly relevant for those who suffer from illiteracy or who haven't been particularly well educated. Now, going back to what the 4 A's, which was mentioned earlier in terms of older persons' rights, I think perhaps we should also we could also add a 5th A, which is accountability. There has to be accountability as well. We have to make sure that older persons are brought on board in these public policies, with accountability being ensured as well. So that was the final point I wanted to make, and I thank you once again.
Very much. Professor Mikołajczyk, your final brief comment?
Yes, I hope that now I can be.
All good. All
yeah,
good.
it's fine. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. My quick comment to the independent expert question. I am sure that it is no problem with introducing the controlling mechanism together with the convention. And just to put older persons' issues onto the list of issues prior to reporting procedure before the other committees, for example. Now it is not a problem with Committee Against Torture and a Committee of Human Rights. The same issues are considered. But I think that we should use also UPR, and I can see the potential in awareness raising of this mechanism. And very quick response to Anna. I think that we need great awareness campaign among decision makers. They should change their thinking about education of adults. And thank you very much for a wonderful panel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And to our final panelist, Mr. Formosa, I'm told we have 1 minute before I have to hand back to the Vice Chair. So over to you.
Thank you, it will be enough. First of all, I want to thank DESA for organizing for the 11th time this open-ended working group on older people. And my final comment is that in order for us to improve the quality of life and well-being of older persons, there is another obstacle which wasn't mentioned today. It basically refers to the fragmentation of aging policy. So when we compare ourselves to policies regarding disability or women and gender, and one aspect is that older people are fragmented, they are divided, they don't give equal importance to all the issues. And I think the future would be a better one for older persons if they all join together and they give the same level of importance to all the different aspects in efforts to mainstream aging. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, thank you all. And it's my pleasure now to hand back to the Vice Chair of the Working Group to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, distinguished delegates. We have come to the end of our time for this panel discussion. I hope you can all agree with me that we had a really interesting and fruitful discussion on the normative elements for the protection of the rights of older persons to education, training, lifelong learning, and as well as social protection and social security. I would like to express my sincere thanks and appreciations to our panelists for their thought-provoking, invaluable contributions, as well as to the delegations, representatives of civil society, and national human rights institutions for participating in this constructive exchange of views and providing their much valued inputs. Before I close, let me address also some organizational work in our future discussions. Before adjourning this meeting, I would like to remind you that tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., the working group will continue its interactive discussion under agenda item 6 on the focus area right to work and access to the labor market. Please rejoin tomorrow's morning meeting with the same link you joined this afternoon. The virtual meeting room will open at 9 a.m. The interactive panel discussion on normative inputs of the open-ended working group on aging is now concluded. The informal meeting is hereby adjourned. Thank you.